would like to introduce Aya Gruber to those not familiar with her work. She's since 2010 professor of feminism, criminal law, and critical race theory at the University of Colorado Law School. And before she received her BA in philosophy at the UK University of California in Berkeley and her law degree from Harvard Law School. As an editor, she was one of those responsible for the Harvard Women's Law Journal and founder of the Interracial Law Students Association. After a period of clerking and working as a defender, she returned to university, where she now is an important voice of gender legal studies and critical race theory. She got several prizes for her outstanding work, of which I will only mention one. That is in 2012, that is 2 years after her arrival at Colorado Law School. The students honored her with the Outstanding New Faculty Member Award, what I liked very much, because that means that she has good relationship to students, what I think is very important. As a theorist, teacher, activist, and as she writes on her homepage, survivor, Aya Gruber challenges with her research the state's penal system in the US and seeks for ways beyond criminal law to achieve more gender and race equality. Her main areas of teaching and writing are criminal law and its procedure, critical theory, feminism, and comparative international law. Her articles appeared in leading legal studies journals, such as, for example, the California Law Review, Northwestern Law Review, and Iowa Law Review. Her last book, The Feminist War on Crime, The Unexpected Role of Women's Liberation in Mass Incarceration, published by University of California Press in 2020, analyzes how feminists, in their quest to secure women's protection from domestic violence and rape, contributed massively to the war on crime and to mass incarceration in the US. Thus, in her text, Aya Gruber articulates a critique of the authoritarian and punitive state law, and she repeatedly warns against subordinating feminist goals and strategies under state policies of penalization, or adapting them to governmental policies of criminalization. Some, like me, she writes, and I quote, denounce the subsumption of the feminist movement into the state's goal of managing undesirables, end of quote. Too unavoidable seems the pitfall of supporting the state's penal system that has taken over the imaginary and governance of security while mainly serving those in power. Thus, Aya puts a big question mark at the assumption that the enforcement of criminal law, even though in favor of minority interests, might serve the empowerment of these same minorities. As European politics of criminalization learned, in quotation marks, a lot from the US-American way to handle the non-desirable and the not desirable during the last decades, we are more than pleased that you accepted our invitation. We, the CrimScapes team, already discussed some of your papers and see a lot of connecting points to our own research. So after the talk, we have the opportunity for Q&A, and we really ask you to ask your question by yourself and to relate Aya's thoughts to our own research. Aya, it's great you are here today, even more though it's really early in the morning for you. Please receive the virtual applause from all participants, and we are curious now to learn what you have brought with you. The floor is yours now.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And really, this is just a delight to be able to connect with what you're doing. I was able to look into it a little bit, and I think it was interesting, Beate, that you said that, and I did a comparative criminal procedure book several years ago, and one of my co-authors was a judge in the Netherlands. And it does seem there was so much transplantation from the American model into Europe, even though European was the older, more formative model, that went along with these projects of political, right, teaching and political production of knowledge in places like widespread in Latin America, and with the result of, increasing prison populations, criminal prison populations in the world. So this connection is wonderful, and thank you, Jeremy and Carmen, also for asking me and setting this up. And I also just want to thank all of you coming. I know it's a really difficult time in our history right now, and to make some time to listen to me, I really appreciate. I did catch the tail end of your discussion before, and I heard a little bit about the next session on vulnerability, which sounds fascinating. So keep me on the list. We actually have a really burgeoning school of vulnerability theory here in the United States that is being championed by a feminist named Martha Feynman out of Emory. And it's a little bit different, I gather, than what you were talking about. But her theory is that, we could have a new basis for racial justice and equality and gender justice and equality if we understand human beings' shared embodied vulnerability. And it's been very interesting. It's been very interesting to think about her work in terms of the fact that a plague has swept the world, exposing our shared vulnerability. And yet at the same time, the political and social fractures have defined whether or not there could be solidarity in that shared embodied vulnerability. And in the United States, there absolutely hasn't. Anyway, I digress. That's not my point. My point is to talk about race and policing in the United States. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the feminist war on crime. So this very week, was the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's murder. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was calm, collected, and in control while he pressed his knee on the neck of a dying man crying for his mother, as were the other officers who casually waved away onlookers. The heart-wrenching viral video, so sad in its inevitability, so evil in its banality, broke something loose. And in the United States, amid other pressing issues of inequality, including a sweeping pandemic that has disproportionately killed Black and Brown people in the United States, a rise of authoritarianism in America and around the world, immigrant concentration camps on the US border, and a major United States political party openly endorsing white supremacism, that video was the event that stirred the American conscience and the conscience of the world. And finally, the masses connected to the suffocation of those in poor communities of color, and people all over the world of all races, 25 million strong, declared, "I can't breathe." I can't breathe is not just a phrase for these times. It's an echo of all the stories, past and present, of social racism, government detention, and state and private violence. The stories I'm about to tell seem unrelated, but they're in fact united in their illustration of how embedded inequality and a zeal for incarceration have denied too many Americans the most obvious, incontestable, and basic of rights, the right to breathe. There was a man who hung out on Bay Street in Staten Island, New York. Everyone in the neighborhood knew him as a gentle giant. He had 6 kids, and he did what he could to make ends meet. With a good head for numbers, he made his money by selling Lucy's, single black market cigarettes at discount prices to passersby. You see, early in former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg's term, his administration needed money to rebuild the business district after September 11th. But he had promised his rich constituents not to raise taxes. So he raised funds not by taxing the foreign real estate investors who made New York City unaffordable to regular people, but by raising taxes on cigarettes to $6 of tax per pack. This made it profitable for people to sell cheap cigarettes from Virginia to the poorest of the poor in poor communities. Now, the man I'm talking about was Eric Garner, and the police didn't like that he sold Lucy's. New York was content to turn the other cheek on their billionaire offshore account-bearing residents, but they strictly enforced the tax laws against impoverished cigarette entrepreneurs like Garner. On a summer day in July 2014, Garner had just broken up a fight when he saw a bunch of white police officers coming towards him. He was surprised that the officers bypassed the people in a fight and made a beeline for him. You see, he didn't know that these officers were under a directive to clean up the streets from the Lucy sellers and their associated riffraff. Although the cops had not seen Garner engaging in any criminal behavior that day, they knew him by reputation. Garner, a Black man, normally erred on the side of submitting to the police, but not on this day. He hadn't done anything and wouldn't submit to arbitrary arrest. That would be one of the first and the last time Garner challenged police authority. The officer put him in that now infamous chokehold. Down on the ground, Eric Garner, gentle giant and father of 6, spent the last moments of his life under a tangle of white police bodies, pleading 11 times, "I can't breathe." There was a 6-year-old girl who went from living in her family home on a farm in Fresno, California, to living in a barbed wire fence surrounded barrack in the middle of the desert in Wyoming. She and the other Japanese kids detained there during World War II didn't understand that they'd been imprisoned for their race, but they understood that their lives took place behind guard stations and fences, and sometimes the white kids would yell insults at them from the free side of the divide. The Japanese kids would respond with their best comeback, Hakuji Ninjin, which roughly translates to Caucasian carrot. These children, suffering in the arid plainlands nearly 3/4 of a century ago, were far better than today's immigrant children, toddlers and infants, who are languishing in makeshift detention camps, fainting in the heat of the southern border, fearful of disease and sexual abuse, and crying out for their parents. Now, this little Japanese girl, Mariko Hirata, grew up and told her daughter vivid stories of the camps. I listened to my mother, transfixed, as she described how the oiled paper windows cast the living quarters in a perpetual half-light, how the communal showers were embarrassing and cold, and how that Wyoming dust would seep into every corner of the shed they called home, so bad that Mariko would complain to her mother that she couldn't breathe. And finally, there was a man in Detroit, a loving husband and father. After coronavirus began to tear through the state, he kept working, driving his public bus route, despite a lack of a mask mandate in Michigan. But he wore a mask and unfailingly wiped down the surfaces of his bus. Still, Jason Hargrove became worried when a maskless woman came on and started coughing. A few days later, he fell ill. His wife, Desha, twice took him to the doctors, who sent Jason, a Black man, home without a COVID test, directing him to soothe himself with Tylenol. But Jason's condition deteriorated quickly, and soon he couldn't breathe. It was only then that he was given a test and admitted to the hospital. African Americans are nearly 5 times more likely to be hospitalized for COVID than whites. The hospital people shuffled Jason off to a COVID ward and sent Desha away. After calling and calling, she found out they had put Jason on a ventilator, but they assured her that he'd be fine. Desha called first thing in the morning. Initially, the hospital people couldn't find Jason's name, and then they couldn't find his chart. And after an hour of giving her the runaround, they finally put a doctor on the phone. He told Desha it was over. Jason had already taken his last breath. A story of brutal street policing, a story of racist mass detention, and a story of health disparity. They seem unrelated, but they all show how unfair economies, racial hierarchies, and pathological politics conspire to deny many Americans the right to breathe. Today, we don't even have to tell stories. We just say names. Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Laquan McDonald, Sandra Bland, Atiana Jefferson, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, Daniel Prude, Adam Toledo, Dante Wright, Micaiah Bryant. This list goes on and on. And then there are all the victims of state violence, of racist health and economic disparities, people whose stories are no less important, but we don't know their names. These stories, these names, these unnamed tragedies, they're the backdrop to the political uprisings we saw after George Floyd. For many, Floyd's killing changed everything. This was the event that made clear that the criminal system's tendency to wound, control, and maintain the subordinate status of the worst off is not a malfunction, but the system's function. 6-year-old Gianna Floyd was right when she said, "Daddy changed the world." Michel Foucault has observed that for academics and policymakers, the perpetual question is why prisons fail to prevent crime, fail to rehabilitate, fail to materially improve communities. The answer is invariably something about the failure of a given penal program and how another newer, shinier one could do better. However, Foucault argues, quote, "For the observation that prison fails to eliminate crime, one should perhaps substitute the hypothesis that prison has succeeded extremely well in producing a politically or economically less dangerous and on occasion usable pathologized subject." Let me put it more plainly. The American prison system has succeeded at disenfranchising many disproportionately Black voters. Even after a slew of recent reforms, the system still disenfranchises 5.2 million Americans. Our prison system has succeeded at maintaining a well-oiled cradle-to-prison pipeline. Our prison system has succeeded in creating a penal archipelago of dark sites where society can tuck away its inconvenient truths, the unemployed, the mentally ill, the unhoused, and increasingly political dissidents. Their invisibility and silence perpetuates the prioritization of profits over people and punishment over problem solving. Similarly, the never-ending question of how the police can better reduce crime has spawned endless proposals of new techniques of management and surveillance that will finally work. Broken windows, hotspot policing, facial recognition. Policing is in a perpetual state of repair. From body cameras to debiasing training, there are a plethora of progressive law and policy reforms intended to control certain officers' racist and violent tendencies so that the police can, quote, better do their jobs. What has been strikingly absent from the mainstream discussion is the idea that officers like Derek Chauvin, like Kim Potter, who shot Dante Wright, these officers who engage in racialized violence, they are doing their jobs. My article, Policing and Bluelining, thus approaches the issue of racialized police brutality from the perspective not of failure, but of success. Indeed, the institution of American policing has been profoundly consistent and effective at disciplining race and space. Of course, the development of state and local police forces is not a uniform story, but rather hundreds of local stories, each with their own lesson. Nevertheless, there is a strikingly consistent feature of policing origin stories. They all have little to do with crime. For example, throughout the South, the creation of organized police forces was a crucial part of states and society's project of maintaining post-Civil War white social and economic supremacy. Now, those who want to maintain the fiction pushed relentlessly upon Americans by hundreds of years of what we call propaganda in the media, bristle at any effort to look at the history of American policing as one of social control of the masses. And they tend to straw man the historical argument as, quote, all police forces everywhere in the United States originated in slavery. And of course, they can knock that straw man down. No one is saying that all policing in the United States originated in slavery. But what we are saying is that if you look at the organization of police forces in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they simply weren't driven by crime spikes, but by political and economic priorities. So, for example, if we look at Reconstruction era police departments in the South, they coalesce from ad hoc groups to aggressively enforce vagrancy and loitering laws that compelled unemployed Black people, right, freedmen or the emancipated, into sharecropping arrangements, reimposing de facto enslavement. An 1865 column in the Lynchburg Virginian paper stated that, quote, stringent police regulations are necessary to keep freedmen from overburdening the towns and depleting the agricultural regions of labor. Historian William Combe describes the operation in detail, quote, at harvest time, cotton farms experienced an acute need for a large workforce, and it was precisely at such times that the police became most active in discovering vagrants. So vagrants, you know, I'm sure you have the equivalent of the broad vagrancy criminalization of the poor statutes. So this is where they came from the United States. In September 1901, a number of Mississippi towns rounded up, quote, idlers and vagrants and drove them into the cotton fields where, quote, the farmers are crying for labor to pick up the season's crop. So common were such practices that the Atlanta Constitution newspaper quipped to the police, quote, cotton is ripening, see that the vags get busy. Meanwhile, turn of the century northern cities were marked by rapid industrialization and immigrant worker influxes. Historians Herring and McMullen trace the development of the Buffalo, New York police force, which was a huge industrial hub, from its inception in 1871 to 1900. They found, quote, the growth of the Buffalo police force had no direct relationship to either the growth of the population or to an increase in crime. So what was it? The historians have an answer, quote, to serve the wealthiest business interests in Buffalo, who exercised direct control over the police department. They conclude the problem of controlling the large dissatisfied working class, who was also minoritized Polish immigrant workers, became the major impetus to the development of the Buffalo police force during the years Buffalo was developing in its industries. In the decades that followed the growth of policing, which was again related not to random crime spikes, but to political priorities and media coverage, in the latter 20th century, much of it was driven by opportunistic politicians' strategy of capitalizing fears of idle Blacks, much like their counterparts 100 years before. After the civil rights uprisings of the 1960s, the images of police brutality against protesters, which were reminiscent of today, caused somewhat of a backlash in the public. So professionalization of the police became popular, especially among liberal Democrats. However, as Naomi Murakawa explains, liberal politicians undertook this project of professionalization, as one Democratic senator remarked, to counter, quote, the deep-seated belief amongst our Negro citizens that equal law enforcement and police practices does not exist anywhere in our land. In other words, it was a propaganda move. The professionalization agenda, with its veneer of data-driven objectivity and hierarchical, disciplined, echelon-based restraint, helped sell the police as crime interdictor narrative and accrued more resources to the police, which they then would use to buy military weapons to fight the coming wars on crime and drugs. But they did not change the basic nature of policing as a project of government control of race and space. And today, police draw blue lines around Black spaces, just as banks drew their red lines, designating certain places, quote, high crime neighborhoods. A 2019 study, the latest in a long line of research, concludes that, quote, officers' assessments and police departments' designations of whether an area is, quote, high crime are nearly uncorrelated with actual crime rates. The suspect's race predicts whether an officer calls an area high crime. Having confined people of color to discrete physical places, the police use violent tactics like aggressive stops and frisks and midnight military raids to keep the people also in their social place. The 2012 federal litigation over New York City's racially disparate and ineffective stop and frisk program included a smoking gun piece of evidence that revealed that racialized social control was always at the heart of the program. State Senator Eric Adams testified during a 2010 discussion he testified that during a 2010 discussion with Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly. Adams, the senator, expressed concerns about the stop and frisk programs. So just in case you don't know what stop and frisk is, that's literally what it is. Police see a person, basically for no reason, they stop them and frisk them. And this had started making the headlines in New York City. And there was a New York Times op doc where one 17-year-old had been stop and frisked 68 times in 1 year. And this was bringing attention to it. So there were hearings and eventually this litigation. And during a 2010 hearing, this state senator, Eric Adams, asked the police commissioner about the stop and frisk program and worried about the racial disparities. And the police commissioner, Kelly, responded that he directed officers to focus on young Blacks and Hispanics, quote, because he wanted to instill fear in them that every time they leave their home, they could be stopped by the police. The senator was, quote, amazed that Kelly was comfortable enough to say that. Now, recently, U.S. Attorney General, the new one under Biden, Merrick Garland, announced a Department of Justice pattern and practice investigation, both of the Minneapolis police, right, of Derek Chauvin fame, and the Louisville, Kentucky Police Department, which killed Breonna Taylor in her home in the middle of the night. So the Department of Justice said it would, in the Kentucky case, amongst other things, look for, quote, unconstitutional home search practices. Will the DOJ find them? Professor Paul Butler has warned that, quote, the problem is not illegal police misconduct. The problem is legal police misconduct, the legal police conduct, right? So let's look at the Breonna Taylor killing and the law that enabled it. Law has been the handmaiden of racialized police brutality. Courts and legislatures have encouraged the police to seek no-knock warrants and raid homes in the middle of the night based on the fiction that such brutality is a necessary component of inherently dangerous drug interdiction. The Supreme Court has made clear that police may engage in this type of home raid even where there is marginal or no probable cause, like in the case of Breonna Taylor, showing little concerns that judges might rubber stamp police requests. The court has insisted, quote, Judges and magistrates are not the adjuncts to law enforcement. Neutral judicial officers have no stake in the outcome of particular criminal prosecutions. In reality, a Denver Post investigation revealed that police shop for judges and, quote, most police officers interviewed could not remember ever having been turned down for a warrant. 97% of no-knock warrants were approved, even ones where the police hadn't requested a no-knock warrant. So let's look at Breonna Taylor. In Detective Joshua James's affidavit in support of that no-knock warrant, he asserted that the connection between Taylor and narcotics was simply this. She happened to be friendly with a drug suspect, Jamarcus Glover, and police had seen him leave her house one time carrying a package. The follow-up investigation was confirming that Glover had received a package at that address, which actually turned out to be a lie from the police officer. He had never received any packages there. But even if it were true, that was it. She knew somebody who once received a package there. Okay, probable cause consisted not of any individualized suspicion that Taylor was involved in drugs, but this Detective James's speculation that, quote, Glover may be keeping narcotics there because drug traffickers receive mail packages at different locations. That was it. That was the probable cause given to the judge. Now, why was James so wedded to the idea that Taylor, that Breonna was receiving drugs for Glover? Why her in particular amongst all Glover's acquaintances? Here's what he said to investigators later. Quote, dealers get other people involved, and it's usually females. It's usually babies' mamas or its girlfriends. So that was James' gendered and raced view of what makes a person suspicious, right? But what about Judge Mary Shaw, who signed the warrant? On the basis of this scant and stereotyping information, the judge gave approval to the search of Taylor's home and 4 other deadly no-knock warrants in 12 minutes. Armed with a judicial mandate and plenty of long guns and military equipment from the federal government, the search team stormed Taylor's home in the middle of the night. Of course, if police were really concerned about the potential for destruction of evidence, they simply would have waited for Taylor to leave her house during the day and gone in. This would have made particular sense, given that police admitted they thought Taylor was a, quote, soft target who posed no danger and that children might be in the house. As one SWAT veteran told a reporter, quote, the thing is, it's so much safer to wait the suspect out and wait for the suspect to leave. Waiting people out is just so much better. You've done your investigation, so you know their routine, so you wait until the guy leaves, end quote. That's from a SWAT team member. However, the allure to cops and the public who watches TV shows about SWAT is the images of SWAT officers bedecked in authoritarian finery, using secretive hand signals and high-tech equipment to storm low-income housing apartments like ISIS bunkers. One former narcotic officer confessed, quote, oh, it's a huge rush. Those times when you have to kick down a door, it's just a big shot of adrenaline. Another said, quote, it's a rush, and you have to be careful because the raids themselves can be habit forming. In the end, the police landed precisely where history, culture, typical practice, and the law put them, at Taylor's doorstep, clad in military gear and breathless to become killers at the first sight of a threat. But now we have the Chauvin murder conviction, and that is some sign of progress. Finally, a legal process was able to see a Black man with some criminal contacts and addiction issues as a real victim. breaking from a condemnable past, spanning from the acquittal of Emmett Till's murderers in the 1950s to the exoneration of the cops who brutally beat Rodney King in the 1990s, to the state's failure to even bring charges against Daniel Pantaleo, who put Eric Garner in that chokehold, or Timothy Loman, who killed 13-year-old Tamir Rice for playing with a toy gun in the 2010s. In Chauvin's case, the until now intractable notion that almost any amount of force that police use against Black people is reasonable, it finally fell under the weight of what the jurors saw with their own eyes. But there is a real danger that people will see this criminal conviction as a finish line. It took a viral video, protest 25 million strong, a state attorney general willing to take over the case and invest millions of dollars before the upper echelon of the police department broke the blue wall of silence. But there's something even more concerning at play. I sat up straight because I was watching the closing arguments when I heard that prosecutor devote a significant portion of his closing statement to emphasize that, quote, Derek Chauvin is on trial. Policing is not on trial. The prosecutor insisted, quote, this is not an anti-police prosecution. This is a pro-police prosecution. But racialized police violence is institutional and structural. It is in the policing DNA, and brutality is its business as usual. The police departments and Chauvin prosecutors' bad apple narrative communicated precisely the opposite. It communicated that police violence is a product of the rare, individually bigoted and murderous bad cop, and not of a racist institution and its entrenched structures. Interest convergence theory and history predict that reformers will find it far easier to succeed with an agenda of empowering prosecutors to convict a few murderous cops who draw media attention than with one of dismantling policing as we know it. To be sure, despite the police department's protestations to the contrary, Derek Chauvin had never been treated like a rogue cop, despite his history of violence. Rather, he was a celebrated 19-year veteran of the force. Several years ago, Chauvin responded to a domestic violence call by breaking into the bathroom where the unarmed African-American suspect, Ira Tolles, was hiding and shooting Tolles twice in his stomach. Tolles later told the Daily Beast that the shooting itself was a blur, but, quote, I remember my baby mother screaming and crying. Chauvin received a commendation for that. Chauvin is no outlier. On August 23, 2020, Kenosha, Wisconsin police received a call from a woman who said her boyfriend wouldn't give her her keys back. That call culminated in Officer Rustin Shesky shooting Jacob Blake in the back 7 times as he tried to enter a car in which his kids, aged 8, 5, and 3, were sitting. It was the 8-year-old's birthday. This incident led to intense protest and police and civilian violence in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Now, as the nation watched the Chauvin trial with riveted attention, few realized that just days before, that Kenosha police officer was ruled by the police department to have acted reasonably. And the Kenosha Police Department, just before Chauvin's trial, returned Officer Shesky to full active duty. Policing and prosecution and prison and the adjacent policies and actors, what we academics often call the carceral state, have been successful at controlling outgroups and dominating space. But perhaps the greatest success of the carceral state has been the occupation of our collective imagination. Carceral logics have become so ingrained that we instinctively see criminal punishment, including Derek Chauvin's punishment, as the key to addressing social harm, creating accountability, and providing justice. This punitive impulse is so strong that advocates and policy makers have continued to jump to criminal lawmaking, even as the United States for decades has had the dishonorable distinction as the most punitive nation on earth. And when I say the carceral state has colonized the American mind, I include my own. Recently, I published The Feminist War on Crime. And in writing it, I had to go back to my own torn feelings about being anti-incarceration and being a good feminist and a survivor. As a law student, I felt stuck in a feminist defense attorney dilemma. I studied and trained to represent indigent defendants against the violence of the state, but I did so with this dread of defending batterers and rapists. I so strongly equated gender justice with policing, prosecution, and imprisonment of abusers and rapists that I worried more about representing a man accused of a misdemeanor low-level domestic abuse than representing someone charged with murder. But then I practiced in a specialized domestic violence court, a court feminism built, where prosecutors pursued cases unconditionally, judges were trained to take abuse seriously, and protection orders were virtually automatic. Now, taking abuse seriously seems undeniably good, but in practice, I saw something different. I saw the same revolving door of poor people of color in and out of incarceration and collateral consequences. I saw prosecutors proceed with cases against women's wishes, and judges refuse to lift stay-away orders, imposing de facto divorce. I saw immigrant women lamenting that their call for help triggered an unstoppable penal machine that made their spouse deportable. In recent years, the United States has experienced unprecedented levels of consensus that the US imprisons too many people, uses criminal law as a solution to too many problems, and that prisons themselves are sites of degradation. But recent years have also seen a surge of feminist activism, often associated with Me Too. And this activism champions zero tolerance for sexual abuse and assault. The puzzling result is that many vocal prison critics and champions of Black Lives Matter protests are also extremely punitive and carceral about gender defenses, even minor ones like street harassment or minimal sexual contact. What about rapists is a conversation stopper when it comes to bail and sentencing reform. And strangely, in the United States today, feminism is one of the few legitimators of penalty in an era of declining faith in criminal punishment. So my book analyzes the complicated stories of feminist advocacy and penal reform over 150 years in an attempt to explain how we got there and how to suggest we can do better. To be sure, feminism is an anti-subordination movement, and one would not expect it to embrace a penal system that famed feminist Susan Schechter characterized as, quote, the embodiment of domination based on race, class, and sex. And yet what I discovered is that at critical moments, powerful feminists repeatedly turned to criminal law. And as such, feminism shaped the modern criminal system, just as participation in the criminal system shaped modern feminism. So I tell stories in my book about domestic violence and how it started out as an anti-state, anti-police movement, but within short order became a pro-policing, pro-mandatory arrest movement. And I don't have time to recount that story initially, but what it hinged on was activism that was based in the courts, based on the activism of lawyers rather than sort of grassroots community activists. And the lawyers had already been engaging the state, and they had already been engaging the police. And what they saw was a system where their clients who were often pretty brutally beaten, battered women, were begging for police and state intervention and arrests. And so that group, which turned out to be a more elite group of feminists than the feminists sort of in shelters and on the streets, pursued their clients' interests. And these were real clients facing real horror. However, they were also a specific subset of clients. They had already separated and were asking for court intervention. But many other women, especially economically marginalized women, didn't seek permanent separation. And women of color didn't necessarily favor arrests. But as researchers observed, from the time institutions, quote, began to develop domestic violence programs, concerns of Black women were virtually ignored. And within short order, police welcomed mandatory arrest policies, which they saw as, quote, getting them out of the social work business, as one criminologist remarked. In later years, the police's aversion to mediation became a justification for mandatory arrest. In 1997, Virginia adopted mandatory arrest, stating that the law should not, quote, require the officer to serve as a counselor. It is unfair to the police officer for him to be required to do more than prevent crime. Within short order, studies also showed that these arrest policies actually escalated violence amongst unemployed African American men. By 1992, researchers possessed enough data to proclaim, quote, mandatory arrest may make as much sense as fighting fire with gasoline. Still, feminists and society's mental commitment to criminal law solutions was strong. Responding to the studies that arrest increased violence among unemployed Black men, one feminist activist writing in 1992 stated, quote, that a few hours under arrest fails to deter the abusers, who are generally considered to be society's failures, is hardly surprising. In some subcultures of ghettoized people, where imprisonment is all too common, a few hours in jail may be seen as only a minor irritation or even a rite of passage. This feminist concluded that for men of color, quote, the stakes may need to be higher, not lower. This story is but one example of how Americans on both sides of the political aisle have a strong, almost instinctive mental commitment to solving social problems through criminal law, including the social problems that are created by the commitment to criminal law. So the story of Floyd's horrific death became one of the necessity to prosecute cops to achieve justice. But accruing more power to prosecutors and jailers is a sad simulacrum of justice. Look at the political, financial, and emotional capital that went into convicting Chauvin. And what we get, the only thing we get, is individual accountability through an American carceral system designed to and preoccupied with inflicting pain on Black and brown bodies. That is not justice. Justice is when there are no more George Floyds. So what can be done? Now, I argue, is the time to think big. We can, for example, just keep pouring money into police departments to study and produce reports and check boxes. Or we can take decisive action to divest and disarm and de-escalate. We can expend massive resources in an effort to get officers to unlearn the violence drummed into them from the get-go and retrain them so they, for example, don't automatically kill mentally ill people. Or we can have trained mental health experts respond to psychiatric emergencies, as many jurisdictions are starting to do. We can spend more money on ineffective and inefficient monitoring, traffic enforcement for racial profiling, or we can just stop having police officers do minor traffic enforcement. Indeed, we can do what Mayor de Blasio did in the aftermath of that New York City stop and frisk litigation I mentioned earlier. In the face of the stark evidence of the program's racist nature, the city could have funded more ineffective and expensive body cams, implicit bias training, and more data collection, or it can do what de Blasio did when he assumed office. With the stroke of a pen, he ended stop and frisk. Stop and frisks went from a high of 686,000 in 2011 to 11,000 in 2017, a 98% decrease. Far from the city lapsing into anarchy, New York's 2017 crime rate was 17% lower than in 2011. And finally, all of us can speak out. We can use our collective voice and make this critical moment in history into a sizable bend in the arc of the moral universe. We can write, protest, and organize, and most crucially, we can vote. I'm sure we don't all share the same vision of a better future, but we can use our voices to move closer to what we each see as a more just world. For me, it is a world where every person who's suffocated under the weight of economic marginality, racial discrimination, and emotional despair can finally and freely breathe.